The butler I shouldn't have trusted. I still remember the first time I met Daniel. It was a bright spring morning in Southern California, the kind where sunlight spills gently through the kitchen windows and dances on the floor like gold dust. Edward and I had just finished breakfast when a young man, barely in his mid-20s, came to the house for an interview. He had an air of quiet confidence about him, crisp white shirt, polished shoes, and a respectful smile that made him seem older than his years. "My name is Daniel, ma'am," he said, with a little bow that almost felt old-fashioned. "I came about the butler position." Edward, my husband, had always been meticulous about help around the house. After running our design firm for years, we both agreed it was time for someone dependable, someone who could handle the household errands and keep things in order while we focused on work and our grown children. Daniel seemed perfect. He was polite, well-spoken, and eager to please. During the interview, he talked about his past experience working for a retired couple up in Santa Barbara and how he'd learned to serve with integrity and gratitude. I remember smiling at that, and such words sounded so pure, so sincere. Edward leaned over and whispered, "He's young, but I like his spirit. Let's give him a chance." So we did. That decision would shape the next 2 decades of my life in ways I could never have imagined. The first few months were almost idyllic. Daniel quickly became part of the rhythm of our home. He would open the curtains in the mornings before I even came downstairs, polish the silverware until it shone, and drive Edward and me to our office in downtown Los Angeles when traffic wasn't too bad. Neighbors complimented me often. "You found yourself a gem, Margaret," they'd say. "He's so respectful and efficient." And I would smile, feeling a quiet pride in the way our little household ran so smoothly. There was something comforting about having Daniel around. He never complained, even on long days. He took care of the garden, made sure the cars were clean, and remembered little things. My favorite brand of tea, the way Edward liked his coffee, the songs we played on Sunday mornings. He was part of the family, or at least that's what I told myself. The first sign of trouble came almost a year later. Edward had sent Daniel to make a deposit, a routine errand he'd done many times before. The amount wasn't small, but we trusted him completely. He came back with a stamped deposit slip, smiling as usual. Nothing seemed amiss. But at the end of the week, when I was reconciling the company account, the balance didn't add up. I double-checked, then triple-checked. Something was off. Several $1,000s were missing. I remember calling out, "Daniel, can you come here for a minute?" He walked in with his usual calm. "Yes, ma'am." I showed him the statement. "The deposit you made on Tuesday isn't reflecting." "Did the bank give you any issues?" He frowned slightly, looked at the teller slip, and said, "No, ma'am. I made the deposit myself. Maybe it's a bank error?" A bank error. That explanation didn't sit right with me. Still, I wanted to believe him. Edward, ever the kind-hearted soul, simply said, "Let's call the bank and sort it out." But when the bank's auditor reviewed the footage from that day, the truth unfolded like a slow nightmare. Daniel hadn't gone to the bank at all. The cameras showed no sign of him. When confronted, he broke down. "I'm so sorry, sir. I don't know what came over me. I needed the money. Please forgive me." Edward looked at him long and hard. I'll never forget the silence that filled the room. Finally, he said, "Daniel, you've disappointed us deeply, but you're young. If you truly want to change, we'll give you that chance." I was stunned. "Edward," I began, but he raised a hand. "Everyone deserves one more chance, Margaret." And that was how Daniel stayed. In the weeks that followed, I tried to convince myself that people make mistakes. After all, Edward's compassion was one of the things I loved most about him. Daniel apologized every day, worked harder than before, and seemed genuinely remorseful. He even left small notes of gratitude on our desk. "Thank you for forgiving me, sir and ma'am. I won't let you down again." And for a while it seemed he didn't. But life has a way of hiding storms beneath clear skies. Looking back now, I realize how blind we were. We saw only what we wanted to see, a young man who'd lost his way but was trying to do better. What we didn't see was the quiet cunning that hid behind his humility, the shadow that was slowly growing inside our home. Sometimes I wonder, Was Daniel always that way? Or did we create the monster he became by forgiving too easily, by loving too blindly? At the time, I couldn't have imagined that this young man, who once served me breakfast with a smile, would one day bring my life to its knees. The years after Daniel's first offense passed quietly, almost deceptively so. He had become, once again, the dependable man we thought we knew. He drove Edward to meetings, reminded me of appointments, and even began to oversee the small team of gardeners and cooks we had on staff. It seemed as though he was truly reformed. By then, our children were all grown, married, successful, scattered across different parts of the country. They came home mostly during holidays, especially Christmas, and our house would fill with laughter, music, and the smell of gingerbread. That particular year, the air felt unusually light. Edward had been in good spirits, and I remember saying to him one morning as we decorated the tree, "You know, dear, it feels good to have the house alive again." He smiled, hanging a gold ornament on one of the branches. "It does, Margaret. It really does." Daniel helped us with the decorations too, humming softly to himself as he strung the lights. The children liked him well enough. They said he was polite and funny, though maybe a little too quiet sometimes. I never imagined that same quietness would soon turn into something darker. It happened on Christmas Eve. Edward and I had stepped out briefly to attend a neighbor's dinner party down the street. The kids were all at home, laughing, watching movies, and wrapping gifts. The house was full of warmth and sound, or so I thought. We were barely gone for an hour when a knock came at the neighbor's door. It was Mrs. Patel from across the street, breathless, panicked. "Margaret, you need to come home right now," she said, her eyes wide. "It's about Daniel." My heart dropped. When we rushed back home, we found one of my daughters, shaken, pale, and crying. I ran to her, pulling her into my arms. "What happened?" I asked, my voice trembling. Through sobs, she said Daniel had entered her room under the pretense of checking if the windows were locked. But then his behavior changed. His tone, his eyes, something in him wasn't right. He'd moved closer, tried to touch her. She screamed, but he told her not to make noise, that he only wanted to talk. It was a sharp knock on the door from our neighbor's teenage son, who'd come to deliver cookies, that broke the moment. Daniel froze and backed away. By the time we got home, he was outside, sitting on the porch, head buried in his hands. Edward confronted him immediately. "Daniel, what on earth were you thinking?" He just cried, big, heavy tears. "I don't know, sir. The devil tempted me. Please, I didn't mean it." I stood there, shaking, not from anger, but disbelief. The same man who had served us tea, who drove me to church every Sunday, had crossed a line I could never have imagined. The house was silent that night, except for Daniel's sobs echoing down the hall. My daughter refused to stay the night in her old room, and I didn't blame her. I sat with her until she fell asleep on the couch, my heart aching with guilt. Edward and I stayed awake until dawn, arguing in hushed tones. "We can't keep him here," I said. "It's not safe, Edward. You saw what he tried to do." "I know," Edward said, his voice heavy, "but he's like a son to me. If we send him away now, who knows what will become of him?" "That's not our responsibility anymore," I replied, tears in my eyes. "He betrayed us once, and we forgave him. And now this." Edward sighed deeply. Maybe this time, he truly needs help." He found Daniel in the morning, still sitting by the pool, his face swollen from crying. Edward spoke gently but firmly. "Daniel, you've done something terrible. You need to leave this house for a while. We'll help you find a counselor, maybe a place to stay, but you can't remain here right now." Daniel nodded slowly, whispering, "Yes, sir. I understand." He packed his things in silence. Before leaving, he turned to me and said, "Ma'am, I don't expect you to forgive me again. But please know I never wanted to hurt anyone. I'm sorry." I didn't reply. I couldn't. For weeks after, I lived with a heavy mixture of grief and relief. Grief, because I'd seen a side of someone I once trusted like family. Relief, because the worst had been averted. The children went back to their own homes after the holiday, though I noticed their smiles were smaller, their goodbyes quieter. The house felt empty again, but this time it wasn't the peaceful kind of empty. It was hollow. Edward never spoke much about what happened, though I knew it weighed on him. Occasionally I would see him standing by the window, staring into the garden, lost in thought. Life returned to a fragile normal. We stopped hearing from Daniel for several months, and in time I began to believe the chapter was closed. I wanted to believe that. But life, I've learned, doesn't end stories neatly. Sometimes it just pauses before the next storm. It was nearly 2 years later when Daniel came back. He appeared one afternoon, standing by the gate with a small bouquet of flowers. He looked thinner, older, as if the world had punished him enough. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I came to say thank you. You and Mr. Lewis gave me a second chance at life. I've been working at a cleaning company downtown. I've changed. I promise I've changed." I was wary, of course. But Edward, kind-hearted Edward, saw hope in the young man's eyes. He invited him in for coffee. As they sat across from each other, I noticed how Edward's tone softened again. "If you've truly changed, Daniel, then I'm proud of you," he said. "Everyone deserves redemption." And Daniel wept, quiet, genuine tears. "You both are like parents to me," he said. "I'll never forget your kindness." Looking back, I wonder if that was the moment I should have said no, the moment I should have kept him away for good. But the human heart has a way of confusing compassion with weakness, and mine, already softened by time and loss, couldn't tell the difference anymore. Edward's decline began quietly. At first it was just fatigue, a soft complaint about shortness of breath after mowing the lawn, or a hand pressed to his chest when the evening air turned cool. He brushed it off, as men of his generation often do. But I knew, after nearly 49 years of marriage, you learn to recognize when something in the rhythm of your life begins to falter. I can still picture the hospital room, the faint beeping, the smell of antiseptic, the gray light of dawn slipping through blinds. I sat by his bed holding his hand, the warmth of it fading slowly beneath my fingers. He tried to joke, as he always did. "Don't look so worried, Margaret," he whispered. "You know I've always been too stubborn to go quietly." I smiled through tears. "Then promise me you'll be stubborn a little longer." Daniel visited every day. He drove me to the hospital, brought sandwiches I never ate, and waited in the hallway without complaint. Sometimes he'd walk me to the chapel downstairs where the silence felt almost merciful. When Edward's heart finally gave out, Daniel was the one who led me to a chair and brought me water. His face was wet with tears too, or at least it seemed that way through my own. The weeks after the funeral blurred together. I would wake to the stillness of our bedroom and listen for Edward's morning cough, the small sound that had once annoyed me but now left a hole in the air. I wandered through the house touching things, his reading glasses on the nightstand, the indentation his body left on the couch cushion. Grief is strange. It makes the living feel like ghosts in their own homes. Daniel became my anchor. He handled the guests, the condolence cards, the endless paperwork. He spoke softly, almost reverently, calling me ma'am again, but with a gentleness that bordered on affection. "Mr. Lewis would want you to eat something," he'd remind me. "Let me drive you to the office, just for a change of scenery." The weeks after the funeral blurred together. I would wake to the stillness of our bedroom and listen for Edward's morning cough, the small sound that had once annoyed me but now left a hole in the air. I wandered through the house, touching things, his reading glasses on the nightstand, the indentation his body left on the couch cushion. Grief is strange. It makes the living feel like ghosts in their own homes. In those days, I leaned on him more than I realized. He was everywhere, carrying my bags, answering the phone, making sure I rested. People from church told me how blessed I was to have such loyal help. I believed them. Gradually, the numbness of grief gave way to something quieter, something like gratitude. Daniel had become my right hand at home and at the company. He would relay messages from the staff, sign for deliveries, even help with small accounting tasks, things Edward once handled with ease. "Don't worry about the books," he said once, taking a folder from me. "I'll get the numbers checked. You just focus on healing." There was a tone in his voice, steady, protective, that I mistook for kindness. I told myself Edward would have approved, that maybe Daniel's loyalty was proof we'd been right to forgive him years ago. Looking back, I can see how isolation made me vulnerable. My children had their own families and visited when they could, but the house was too large, too quiet. When Daniel knocked on my door each morning asking, "Are you all right, ma'am?" the sound was almost comforting. I started to confide in him. Small things at first, worries about the business, my loneliness, the way the nights seemed longer now. He listened. He always listened. Sometimes he'd share stories about his own life, about growing up without much, about wanting to prove himself. Those stories made me soften even more. In him I saw a reflection of what Edward might have seen long ago, a young man trying to do better. But kindness, when unguarded, can be dangerous. Daniel began to manage more of my affairs. He answered calls meant for me, postponed meetings, and assured me everything was under control. "Let me handle it, ma'am," he'd say. "You don't need the stress." And I let him, because trusting him was easier than confronting the ache of doing it all alone. One night, months after Edward's death, I sat in his old study and opened the ledger he'd kept for decades. Inside were his careful notes, every expense, every bank transaction. I ran my hand across his handwriting and felt a surge of determination. Edward would want me to keep this place running properly, I whispered to the empty room. When I asked Daniel for the newer account statements, he smiled reassuringly. "I already organized those, ma'am. I'll bring them tomorrow." He didn't. And somehow, in the fog of grief and exhaustion, I didn't notice. The seasons turned. I began to smile again, tentatively at first, then more often. I started hosting small lunches with the staff, planting new roses in the garden Edward had loved. Life was returning, or so it seemed. Daniel stood beside me through it all, calm and composed, his loyalty appearing absolute. If anyone had told me then that he was already laying the groundwork for betrayal, I would have dismissed it as cruelty. Because by then, Daniel wasn't just my employee, he was my bridge to the world I'd lost. Grief makes you reach for the nearest hand in the dark. I reached for Daniel's, never realizing he was the one quietly turning off the lights behind me. The years after Edward's death folded into one another like pages of a book I didn't remember writing. Each morning began the same way, coffee cooling beside untouched toast, Daniel's voice at the door. "Morning, ma'am. Do you need anything?" I thought I'd finally built a rhythm again, fragile but serviceable. He ran the office, paid the bills, arranged maintenance. The world seemed to hum along without demanding much of me. Until the day the humming went slightly off-key. It started small. A vendor called, asking about a payment that was overdue by 6 weeks. I frowned, certain Daniel had handled it. He assured me he had. "Must be an accounting mix-up," he said with that easy half-smile. But the next week, another call came, then a third. When I asked for the statements, he brought only a few pages, neatly stapled. Too neat, too selective. "These are the ones relevant to you," he said. "No need to worry about the rest." Something in his tone, gentle but dismissive, made my chest tighten. I told myself it was grief talking, that I was imagining things. Still, I began checking small details, the mileage on the car, the bank alerts, the number of errands that seemed to take him just a little longer each time. The cracks widened quietly like hairline fractures in glass. One afternoon I stopped by the bank myself. The manager, who'd known Edward and me for years, looked up with surprise. "Mrs. Lewis, we haven't seen you in a while?" He hesitated when I asked for a full account printout. "Didn't Daniel already pick up last month's?" The words landed like a pebble in water, small, but the ripples spread fast. I smiled politely. I'd just like a copy for my own records. When the papers slid across the counter, I felt my pulse in my throat. There, in neat rows, were dozens of transfers, each small, almost unnoticeable on its own, but together they formed a river flowing steadily out of my life. Daniel's name wasn't on any of them, of course. They were sent to accounts under other names, all unfamiliar, all neatly disguised. For a long minute I couldn't move. The quiet hum of the bank faded. I saw only Edward's handwriting in my mind, his meticulous ledgers, his trust in Daniel. I folded the papers, tucked them into my bag, and thanked the manager with a voice that wasn't quite mine. Back home, I sat in the kitchen and waited. The clock ticked loudly, marking every second until Daniel's car pulled into the driveway. When he walked in, smiling as always, I held up the papers. "Daniel," I said softly, "what is this?" He froze. The mask slipped, just for a heartbeat, but I saw it. Then came the familiar performance: confusion, denial, wounded loyalty. "Ma'am, you must be mistaken. Those transfers were authorized. Business expenses, Mr. Lewis had planned." "Don't," I interrupted. My voice cracked. "Don't use his name to lie to me." He looked at me then, not with guilt, but with something colder. Pity, maybe, or irritation that I'd finally noticed. For the first time in years, I saw the young man from long ago, the one who'd forged a teller slip and blamed the devil. "I trusted you," I whispered. He shrugged slightly. "You needed me." Those words echoed through the room, hollow and cruel. The rest of that evening blurred. I remember my hands trembling, the papers slipping from my fingers. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. I stood to leave the kitchen, but the world tilted. A dull roar filled my ears, and the edges of the room folded inward like curtains closing. I felt myself sinking, not falling, just fading, as if the body had decided it couldn't bear another ounce of betrayal. I thought of Edward then, of the way he used to steady me with just a touch on the shoulder. I tried to call his name, but the sound stayed trapped somewhere inside me. Then there was only stillness. When I woke again, the room smelled of antiseptic and lilies. The flowers Daniel had brought to the hospital, the nurse later told me. He was gone by then, vanished before the investigation began, before the auditors found out just how much he'd taken. I should have felt anger, maybe even relief. Instead, there was only emptiness, like a house stripped of all its furniture, the walls still standing, but the warmth gone. And in that emptiness, a single truth settled quietly. Betrayal doesn't always come with thunder. Sometimes it arrives in polite tones, carrying your morning mail. Soft reflection. If grief is the first thief of peace, betrayal is the second. One takes what you love, the other takes what you believe in. But even now I tell this story not for vengeance, but to remind myself that light does return, however faint, even after the deepest darkness. The weeks after the stroke were quiet, too quiet at first. The house, once filled with laughter, the hum of a busy household, now felt like an echo chamber. I moved slowly, sometimes forgetting what day it was, sometimes reaching for Edward's picture on the mantel as if it could hold me upright. People came and went, friends, family, even neighbors checked in. Their voices were kind, soft, sometimes overwhelming, but I learned slowly to breathe in their presence without letting it suffocate me. Daniel never came back. No messages, no explanations, only the lingering echo of everything I had once trusted him with and everything he had stolen. Recovery is strange. It's not a race. There's no finish line. Some days I could dress myself and walk into the garden to feel the sun on my face. Other days the grief would return so sharply that I couldn't rise from my chair, and the world felt like it had been shrunk down to one corner of the living room. I began keeping a journal, not the neat, polished kind, but a messy record of small victories. The first time I could make tea without help, the first time I laughed at a joke on television, the first time I didn't feel his absence in the hallways. Each page reminded me, life continues, even when it is stolen from you in pieces. I also began looking through Edward's old letters, his business journals, the photographs of our children as they grew. It became my way of reconnecting to the life that Daniel had tried to fracture. I discovered as I read that Edward had faced setbacks in his own career, moments of betrayal, challenges that seemed insurmountable, yet he had always continued with courage, with patience, with a steadfastness I had loved for decades. I realized then that I could do the same, not by ignoring my pain, but by acknowledging it, by letting it teach me rather than define me. Slowly, I returned to the world outside my grief. I reopened the small part of my company that I could manage. I started speaking more directly with staff, trusting my instincts rather than intermediaries. I learned to check my accounts personally, not just rely on others' assurances. I began to rebuild boundaries I had once allowed to dissolve. It was not easy. Some days I felt overwhelmed by fear that another Daniel could slip in unnoticed. But fear, I found, is a sign that you are alive. It can also be a guide, showing where your vigilance must be firm. And yet, despite everything, I learned to trust again, not blindly, but carefully. I found kindness in friends and neighbors, even in strangers. I saw it in my children, who came more often now, and in my grandchildren, who laughed with abandon and reminded me that life is above all fleeting and beautiful. I sometimes think of Daniel. I wonder what became of him, whether he ever felt the weight of the choices he made. But I no longer dwell on him with fear or hatred. That would have been allowing his betrayal to shape the rest of my life. Instead, I dwell on Edward, on the decades we shared, and on the self I am slowly reclaiming. Survival does not mean forgetting. Recovery does not mean perfection. Rebuilding trust does not mean opening the door to anyone and everyone. It means learning to walk in your own house again, to live in your own body again, to find your own voice again after it has been silenced. I walk through my garden each morning, touching the petals of the roses Edward planted. I smile, sometimes, even laugh aloud when the sun strikes the water in the fountain just right. And I tell myself quietly, the darkness has passed, and though scars remain, I am here. I am still standing. I am still learning to trust, not just others, but myself. Sometimes I think that's the greatest gift Edward left me. Not wealth, not comfort, but the courage to continue after loss, betrayal, and heartbreak. And in that courage, I have found a quiet peace.